Welcome to the Briar Masterclass here at the Fabled Academy. Today we are taking a look at the Briar basics with Charles Dunn, who won the US Nationals this year on Briar. Charles, welcome to the Academy.
Thank you for having me. Really excited to be here and to talk about one of my favorite heroes, Briar.
Yeah, I'm so stoked to talk to you because the US is so wide. There are so many pro players and it's an honor to talk to the US Nets champion from this year.
Yeah, thank you. You're right there. The U.S. is filled with tons of great players, and that was a real slog getting through the U.S. Nationals, but really happy to have come out on top this year, and always looking forward to good competition.
So before we taking a dive deep on Briar, tell me, what do you think about the Living Legend format coming now at this time to the World Championship in Barcelona?
Yeah, really excited for it. Obviously, I'll be at the World Championship. I'm hoping to be playing in the top 8 instead of playing in the Battle Hardened on Sunday, but we'll see how that goes. But yeah, the Living Legend format is going to be very different than the Flesh and Blood we've been playing for a while. Just much more higher power cards, a lot of the highly synergistic decks from the past few years that have obviously been really strong. You can now come back and play with all of them, all the banned cards and everything. So it should be a really exciting time and a relatively unexplored format. There's not a lot of events before that. For a lot of players at that Battle Hardened, it'll probably be their first time playing the format in a real tournament. A lot can happen, and really excited to see how it shakes out.
Yeah, it will be really interesting because, like you said, there will be most players available outside of the top 8 of the World Championship to play on Sunday at the Battle Hardened, and of course also the tops that are coming to the calling. But we will see, like, this is the first tournament, and I think that's also the interesting part to now talk about Briar, because she is doubtedly one of the most powerful heroes in the game. She was a Radat, so she is not that powerful as in the beginning when she came out, but there are also a few different playstyles that we may see or not. So before we jump into talking about those, I want to let the viewers know that we have a basics video on the channel talking about the Living Legend format. So if you're not familiar with the format, check that one out. But now let's jump into the Briar basics. Charles, tell us a little bit more about yourself. What is your experience with Briar?
Yeah, so obviously my biggest point on Briar is winning the US Nationals this year with a rather unconventional version of Briar. I think it's fair to say. That version had a lot more defensive capabilities and was playing single individual large attacks, things like Findell's Fighting Spirit and Lightning Strike, things like that, which is unusual compared to what most other people were playing Briar and what I had played quite a bit in some local events and some smaller tournaments, which was Channel Not Heroic Briar. I'd played that quite a bit throughout, mainly at smaller local levels. So I was very familiar with the play styles and the power of Briar and also the flexibility. And so that really led me to my signature win on Briar at US Nets.
What is it really that you like so much about Briar?
It really is the flexibility and just the value that she can generate from her hero power. She has 2 halves of the hero power. One lets you create an embodiment of lightning to give your attacks go again, which is obviously very good for an aggressive deck that wants to be playing pump spells and going wide and attacking multiple times. But then the other half is whenever those attacks, which she's a very good attacking deck, when those attacks hit, you get an embodiment of Earth, which lets her be very strong on defense. And so you have this deck with really good offense, and you turn that offense into pretty good defense, certainly compared to other aggressive decks. That plus the split damage, you have arcane damage coming in as well as physical, makes her just very hard to defend against, especially in late game scenarios where both players are on low life, they need to pitch for Arcane Barrier to stay alive. It just feels like a very complete package to me. There's no real obvious weakness or gaps in Briar's playstyle, and that lets her just do very well into a variety of metagames with a variety of builds.
So Briar was, throughout the era where she was legal in CC, a feared hero. She won a Pro Tour piloted by Matthew Folks. You won the US Nationals with her, and on completely different builds. So let's talk about the different playstyles that were available with Briar till today and what might change in the Living Legend format to that.
Yeah, so I'd say there's mainly 3 different types of Briar builds that you that we've historically seen. 3 different broad categories. The first one was right as she came out, when she had Ball Lightning and Plunder Run, and really nothing was banned. This was called the Cheerios Briar, sometimes because everything costs 0 in the deck. And this deck just wanted to go really wide. It wanted to be just attacking and just hitting as hard as possible, as fast as possible, making 3-4 attacks per turn. And then once Ball Lightning and Plunder Run got banned because they were extremely good cards, a lot of the Briars pivoted to the Channel Mount Heroic Briar. And this focused a bit heavier on blues, especially Earth blues, so that you could play Channel Mount Heroic. And when you do find Channel Mount and you get to stick it on the board for a few turns, it makes all of your attacks really strong. Your 0 for 4s become 0 for 7s, and you can get a lot of value out of that. And so that was a little bit slower than the Ball Lightning Plunder Run, obviously, because you're playing a bit lower power, but it could have crazy big turns as well with Channel Mount Heroic plus Force of Nature to basically make every one of your cards threaten on hit to draw a card. It had a lot of power, but a little bit less consistency. And then we go into, obviously, what was my version of Briar that had kind of took all of that aggressive playstyles and threw it out the window and started playing Sink Blows and Fate Foreseens and Oasis Respite and Crown of Seeds, just all these defensive tools. And really, I leaned on the make an embodiment of Earth part of her hero power. And I almost never made the embodiment of Lightning because I didn't want to attack wide. I just wanted to block as much as possible and then maybe attack once with one big attack to get my embodiment and then be able to block efficiently on the back end.
When we are talking about the playstyles that we have seen, it is also interesting to take a look at what we might see in the Living Legend format. These different playstyles, what do you think about them? Do you think we will see a broad variety, like heavy aggro decks like Fi with Stubby Hamras, and then also fatigue decks like Oldhim or the Briar list that you built? Or will it mostly be like aggro against aggro?
I think, you mean the format as a whole, across every deck, or just within Briar?
Yes, as a whole.
The whole format, I think there's going to be more aggressive decks. I think those are a little bit easier and more straightforward to build. You're going to have Stubby Hammers, Fi. I think the more aggressive Briar lists will be the aggro decks of choice. I think if you're trying to play a very defensive fatigue style deck, the other decks in the format are just really strong and are just going to be able to overpower your defenses. But I do think there are some decks that could lean a bit more slower. I think Starvo probably fits in that category. You can play aggressive on Starvo, but he has good defensive tools as well. And so he's totally fine playing a longer game. And Chain as well, you don't think of it as like a fatigue deck, but it is totally happy to take a longer game and set up a pitch stack and then hit a big combo in the end game, if that's how the game dictates it. I think we'll see it lean towards aggro, but I wouldn't be surprised if there's a few slower decks here and there that can do well.
So let's talk about Briar's position then in the Living Legend format. What do you think are the best matchups that Briar can run into?
Yeah, I think the Briar deck that we're most commonly going to see is probably going to be the Ball Lightning, Plunder Run, kind of Cheerios Briar. It's the fastest, most aggressive version, most consistent. And I think the other versions are just a little too slow compared to the other aggro decks of the format. That being said, I think the strongest matchups for it are probably going to be Prism. Prism is obviously a Living Legend hero that has a lot of good value, but she has historically struggled into very aggressive decks. Prism has some auras that don't block very well, and she wants to get set up, and at the end of Briar's combat chain, she can just send her weapon to pop an aura if there's one around. So I think Briar will do very well into Prisms. The other decks that we're anticipating being very popular in the format are things like Chain. I think that is a matchup that certainly couldn't feel Briar favored. Briar is just a little bit faster, can come right out of the gate and just be at full power, and Chain takes 3 or 4 turns to get set up with the shackles. And so if you can really push that advantage in the early game while Chain is trying to set up, and especially with the card Warmonger's Diplomacy, which is a card that Chain never had to face whenever Chain was in the standard format. If you can just find one of those and hit it at a key time, it can really disrupt Chain as well. So I feel like Briar has reasonably good matchup there. On the flip side, I think into Starvo, this version of Briar can probably struggle, this Ball Lightning Plunder Run version. It doesn't have a lot of good ways of covering a Winter's Wail, so a Frostbite is pretty devastating. It doesn't have too many blues. And also, if Starvo just gets his his reveal off and then can hit you with a Spinal Crush or a Crippling Crush or something like that, you don't have too much of a recourse to that. You have a little bit of armor, maybe you can survive one of these hits, but if you change them together, it's going to be bad news for you. Luckily, you're trying to make the game last as short as possible. You're trying to be as aggressive as possible, so he doesn't have that many opportunities. If Starvo does stumble, you can still win that matchup. And I guess the last deck that I anticipate being very popular will be the Stubby Hammer's Phi deck. Just a all-out aggressive, trying to go as wide as possible. I think that's going to be a close matchup with Briar. They have very similar game plans where both decks really don't want to block and just want to be as aggressive as possible on turn 1, 2, 3. So I think that one will be a very close matchup, close to 50-50. It's hard to say if one side is favored there.
So a last hero that I want you to tell us your opinion on is Oldhim. What do you think about Oldhim in the Living Legend format?
Yeah, Oldhim is... I think in some ways he's a little bit just outclassed by Starvo. They can play many of the same cards. Oldhim obviously can't play lightning cards, and you probably play him a little bit differently. But most of their card pool is overlapped with Starvo. And so you really have to look at what is Oldhim bringing to the table that Starvo can't. And I think that is the defense reaction on his hero that can be disruptive or save you some extra life. And Oldhim will probably be better if you're anticipating games to go very long and you want to be defensive and you just want to wear them out. I do worry about that kind of strategy given the sheer power level of the attacking decks. The Stubby Hammers, Phi, the Ball Lightning Briars. Even if you block out with everything, you still might take a bunch of damage. And that is a big problem. And I also think that Oldhim is going to struggle into Prism if people end up playing Prism. He could have good matchups. I think you can build an Oldhim to be good into Starvo, and I think you can build Oldhim to be good into Chain. So we have to see exactly how the meta shakes out, but I think at first glance, I think Oldhim is a step below the other decks that are a bit more obvious to be playing in the format.
So when talking about the Living Legend format, it is also interesting to consider the differences between the classic constructed format and what you want to play at Sunday at the Battle Hardened. A hero that is really dominant at the moment is Lexi. Do you think we will see her also in the Living Legend format, and what are the differences in her power level to classic constructed?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Lexi historically was not a very good deck. Back when Starvo and Chain and all these decks were around, she just really was just fell short. And it wasn't until they rotated out, but also Lexi got new cards like Codex of Frailty, Heat Seeker, Drill Shot, that she really started putting up the results that she has. I think there's a potential there where she does have a lot more tools than she ever had to compete with these decks. But at the same time, most of her cards that she wants are currently in Standard, or the regular Classic Constructed. So I don't know how much she really gains from going into Living Legend. I think some of the cards are a lot similar to the Briar ones. You could have something like Ball Lightning. Obviously, Lexi is a lightning hero as well. So maybe she pivots to be a bit more aggressive and tries to lean on Ball Lightning. I think there's potential there, but I'm not that optimistic that it will be a dominant force. Certainly not as dominant as in Classic Constructed.
And as you said, like Briar and Lexi are sharing a certain amount from the card pool. And do you think Briar will have an easy matchup into Lexi if a player wants to face her?
I think if you are going to bring Lexi into a Living Legend format, you probably are going to build it in such a way to beat up on these aggressive decks. You maybe, instead of the current versions in Classic Constructed are a bit more fuseless. They don't have many elements, and then they're just relying on Heat Seekers and things like that and Infecting Shot. I think if you're going to take it into Living Legend, you're probably going to want to play a bit more ice heavy. Things like Frostlock is really good into Phi and Briar. There's potential there if you're building it in such a way that Lexi could be favored into Briar. It just depends. How do you build the Lexi? It's a big question. She's got a lot of cards, a lot of different ways you can take her. But I think you could tailor her to beat up on aggressive decks like Briar.
All right. So to all the viewers, if you still have questions regarding Briar's position in the Living Legend format, leave them down in the comment section. And also check out the second part of the video that will be coming up, where we actually talk about the build on Briar in the Living Legend format. But now let's talk about the main play patterns that we want to pull off with Briar in the Living Legend format. Like you already said, Ball Lightning Briar with Plunder Run might be the most favored version in the Living Legend format. And how do we actually pull off this deck to be as strong as possible?
Yeah, one of the most important things when playing this version is worrying about what card is in your arsenal and making sure your arsenal is set up properly. There's a few cards that you really want to put there to set up your bigger combo turns. Sting of Sorcery is a card that has seen basically no play since Ball Lightning was banned, because that was really the huge synergy. Sting of Sorcery makes all of your attacks do 1 arcane when you attack with them, and then when you have Ball Lightning out, it gets amplified even further because they all get +1 from the Ball Lightning. When you do find a Sting of Sorcery, if you don't need to pitch it for a blue, it's really advantageous to try to park that in Arsenal and then wait till you have a hand that has at least 1 Ball Lightning, preferably more, so that you can go really wide and push a ton of damage with that Sting of Sorcery. Also, to consider your arsenal is thinking about Plunder Run. It's a card that really benefits when you do play it out of arsenal, and in a similar vein, you could just play Plunder Run out of hand, and then hopefully you draw a card and you get half of an embodiment of lightning. That's okay value for it, but it's really understanding when it makes sense to play that out in order to get that embodiment, to get go again, versus when it makes more sense to arsenal it to get bonus damage value. Is an important skill when playing this version of the deck. And in order to help you sort of make that decision is about like making your early attacks and then understanding how your opponent is trying to block, and just getting a read on them. If you play like 1 attack to start and they don't block it, then you know, okay, they don't want to block, I should press as aggressively as possible. And maybe that means playing out your entire hand and not saving an arsenal. But if they do start blocking right off the bat, then maybe it's better to take it slow and set up an arsenal for a bigger turn next turn.
All right, so you already mentioned a few of the key cards that we actually want to care about and look out for. We will take a deeper look into that in the second video. But now let's talk about the common mistakes that players want to avoid when bringing Briar to the Living Legend format.
Yeah, I think the biggest mistake that any Briar player can make is missing their triggers. She's got a lot of triggers from her hero power. It makes embodiments of Earth when an attack action hits, or rather the first time when an attack action hits, and making your embodiment of Lightning when you play your second non-attack action of the turn. Especially if you're going to be playing at a competitive rules level event like the Battle Hardened in Barcelona. It's very important that you are on top of those triggers and you don't progress the game state and miss them, because if you miss them, you're not allowed to get that token. I've often done it where I have my embodiment of Earth token over by my life pad, where I write down the life totals so that, oh, I went over there to change life totals. I should put this embodiment of Earth in play because that's probably what just happened. So really just making sure you're playing slow enough. The deck is very fast, so take your time, make sure you're looking and don't miss those triggers. It's very important. And it's the core power of Briar. The second one is a little bit ironic. A common mistake you might see in Briars is being overly aggressive. Obviously, it is a very aggro-focused deck. You want to be aggressive as possible, but you do get those embodiment of Earths, and a big part of the value of Briar, as I mentioned at the start, was you can turn your great offense into pretty good defense as well. And so sometimes it makes sense if your hand isn't perfect, it doesn't have everything just come together. Maybe you have 2 attacks that don't have go again, and you can only get 1 of them to have go again. You really want to feel comfortable just blocking with that extra card. Blocking with, especially if it's a 3-block, something like Arcanic Shockwave. Just being okay with blocking with it. Yes, it could attack for 4, but it's okay to just slow things down, send 1 or 2 cards block, and then just maybe make 1 attack and then set an arsenal to set up for future turns. You do have that advantage of the embodiments of Earth to help your non-attacks block better, and don't try to use your Snapdragon Scalers just to bail out a bad hand very early on if it's not a really important turn. So just don't be afraid to play it a little bit slower.
All right, so these were really some great tips to start off with Briar and thinking about playing her at the Living Legend format. Charles, do you want to shout out anyone here at the end of the video?
So in the deck list that I would play, if I was playing in the Living Legend format, I have to give a shout out to Tariq Patel, who made this version. I copied a lot of his deck list from US Nationals 2 years ago when this was legal. Obviously updated with new cards and made some modifications, but his deck was definitely the basis for this because I think it was a very well-made deck and just needed some updates with new cards. So definitely shout out to him for that.
All right, Charles, thank you so much for taking the time diving into the basics with Briar and also for preparing the deck list that we will look at in the next video.
Thank you for having me.
And to all the viewers, thank you so much for tuning in today's masterclass. If you have further questions, leave them in the comment section. Like the video if you found it helpful and subscribe to the channel for future masterclasses.